expertise that you all bring to the table. So we wanted to take this opportunity this morning to both start with, obviously, we have a few items that are just general, how to be on Zoom items, please use your camera and all. And we wanted to make sure that you all knew that we had a long conversation about whether or not these, how to make these meetings as open and transparent as possible, and do it also in a way that really allowed for you all to have the candid conversations that we think are significant and necessary for us to really think about economic recovery and recovery from the pandemic in ways that really center students in that work and for our higher education systems. So what we decided to do is that we will be making the transcripts from these conversations public. We'll be posting them on our website. We are inviting people to comment and to share conversations with us, but we want to make sure that we're holding the integrity of the conversation as it's taking place. So just a reminder that these are being recorded and will be posted going forward, along with the meeting materials that we are circulating in advance. We also wanted to make sure that we are mindful of just all of the talent that you all are bringing to the table. And so with that, we thought we would start each of these meetings with an opportunity to get to know some of the folks around the table who some of you may not know as well. And I was reminded at the first meeting that Michelle Siqueiros said, I can't believe I'm on this task force. I'm sitting here with some of my heroes like Tim Rennick. And I thought, everyone should know why Tim Rennick is one of Michelle Siqueiros' heroes. And so we thought we would start by having an opportunity to talk with Tim a little bit about some of the work that he is doing. And so I wanted to actually put the question to him. Tim, why do you think that you're one of Michelle's heroes to start? And we could have a little conversation. We'll talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll invite others to ask you some questions. So why are you a hero?
Yeah, thank you. I'm honored to be with you and honored to be a hero to anybody. I would love for the work of Georgia State not to be seen as heroic. And I think part of my presence here on the task force is to try to convince you that there is nothing extraordinary about what Georgia State has done. We've done some commonsensical things, and we've done them at scale. So I think, you know, the headline is that we've had 6 years in a row now. We're a very big minority serving institution, 54,000 students. We've had 6 years in a row now where our Latinx, our Black, and our Pell students have graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. We've done that at a time when we're doubling the number of underserved students we enroll, and at a time when our SAT scores for incoming freshmen have gone down by 30 points. So that all seems very implausible from a national perspective, that you're admitting more students from more diverse backgrounds with lower test scores, and yet your graduation rates are doubling for these same students, and you're eliminating equity gaps. And my message to the task force is, you know, this is not something that should be out of the ordinary, that we've done it by delivering common sense interventions, in many cases data-based, but common sense interventions at scale. And that should be promising for all of us on this call, that it doesn't take extraordinary efforts. It doesn't take a half a dozen or a dozen different specialized targeted boutique programs. It takes doing things at scale across a whole institution. And if there's any distinction between Georgia State and many of our peers in the student success sphere, it's that when we found something that works, we have scaled it across our whole student body so that it just becomes the norm at Georgia State rather than an exception for a subpopulation.
That's great. If you were going to point to one or two or maybe three of the key interventions that you think that have really turned the tide, what would you say they are?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that have emerged at the interventions. I'll make this as a starting observation, and then I will share a couple practical tips. We are diverse in multiple ways. So Georgia State not only enrolls the largest number of Black students in the state of Georgia, we also enroll the largest number of Latinx, largest number of Pell, largest number of first generation, largest number of military learners, and the largest number of adult learners. So when we had to look at these issues, and this started around 10 years ago, a little over that, we couldn't practically serve every group individually, right? It would have been overwhelming to say, let's develop a program for our transfer students, a different program for our military learners, different program for our Latinx. So what we tried to do is find via our own data ways in which Georgia State was obstructing the progression of large number of students, regardless of background. What were the main stumbling blocks that we were creating? Main, because those would be the ones that would have the biggest impact if we could resolve them, and across the whole student body. And we focused on things that we had control over, not things that were out of our control. So what we came up with were a couple of the following things. One is we spent quite a bit of time looking at summer melt. We found that we were losing about 20% of our confirmed freshmen every year, incoming students, before they even made it to a single day of classes. And when we looked at the data, we found that these students were overwhelmingly from underserved backgrounds. They were overwhelmingly low income, first generation, and underrepresented minorities. So one of the things we've developed is AI enhanced chatbot that we use to communicate with students all through the months before they first enroll at Georgia State. You know, that's a deadly period between the time students have left their high schools and their counselors and their teachers, but before they start college. Those 3 or 4 months weed out a lot of students and weed out disproportionately students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So we found a way to communicate with these students effectively. In the first 3 months, we launched this chatbot. We had over 180,000 questions answered for just our incoming students. Average response time was about 6 seconds. What the platform does is walk students through processes like the FAFSA process, verification, help students who can't find their or haven't gotten immunization records to resolve these issues. But it's available to the students 24/7. One of the most sobering things we heard about the chatbot when we first launched it, we did focus groups with the students, they admitted they asked the chatbot questions they wouldn't have asked a human being. You know, if you can't get your biological father to sign the FAFSA because you haven't seen him for the last 2 years, the last thing you want to do is go into some stranger's office and spill out your history to that individual. The students liked the fact that the chatbot was a bot, it was non-judgmental, they could ask a question no matter how embarrassingly and get an immediate response. And what happened over 3 years of using this tool during the summer is we've reduced summer melt by almost 40%. And almost all of the 40% that we've gained back into our first year class are students who are Pell eligible, first generation, and students of color. So it's these sorts of things. Another quick example is we found we were losing lots of students, not because they were not academically qualified, they were dropping out of Georgia State because they couldn't pay their tuition and fees. And what we found in our data that was most disturbing is the greatest subset of the students who were leaving us for financial reason were not first year or second year students, they were our seniors, students who were within a semester or two of graduating. Why were the seniors leaving us for financial reasons? They were the ones running out of eligibility for their scholarships, right? You know, the largest state scholarship in Georgia covers 4 years. 80% of our undergraduates are working students. It's hard to graduate in exactly 4 years. And so if they went even one semester over, all of a sudden they were having to come up with thousands of additional dollars that they didn't have and walking away. So we started a program back in 2011, we call it Panther Retention Grants, micro grants aimed at seniors who have exhausted their eligibility. And the magic of the program is students don't need to go through any bureaucracy. They don't need to apply for the grants. They don't need to come into any office and self-identify. We look at the data for students who are close to graduating, academically on path, and at risk of leaving us for financial reasons, and we put the money in the student's account. We've done that over 19,000 times over the last 7 or 8 years, and almost 80% of these students have gone on to graduate. By our own tracking, these same students in the past who were leaving us in their senior year for financial reasons, only 30% were ever coming back to graduate. What's interesting about these kind of approaches is they are universal. They're not just for our Pell students or just for our Black students, they're for all students. But what we found once we scaled these programs up is the students who benefit disproportionately are the students who struggled the most under the old bureaucracies at Georgia State.
Fascinating. One other question before I open it up to everyone else, which is one of, some of the research that I've done in the past shows that we could actually do a whole lot related to equity if we were simply to close achievement gaps. What kinds of programs do you have in place that are kind of attentive to closing achievement gaps, even with this kind of universal model that you, or universal approach that you all have been putting forward?
Well, I think the interesting thing about Georgia State data, and that's why I shared the one pager that looks at our data longitudinally, is by scaling these programs across our whole student body, we got the unexpected result of closing achievement gaps. Now, in all honesty, we have, and I oversee as part of my administrative portfolio, an Office of Black Student Achievement, a Latino support office. We have special programs for our transfer students as they come in and so forth. But to be honest, we had those programs before the progress was made in closing equity gaps. Where we really began to make the gains is when we began to diagnose problems that affected our students and resolve those problems at the institutional level. I think the benefits are twofold of that approach. One is that there are students in all categories who can benefit from a microgrant, who can benefit from better support as they're entering the institution, who can benefit from our advising approach where we're using predictive analytics to track every student every day for 800 different risk factors, and our advisors are reaching out proactively the moment a student goes off path. If they register for the wrong course, if they get a low grade in a quiz, if they don't log on to their online class, they're hearing by somebody almost immediately. All the students can benefit from that, and you'll see that our graduation rates have gone up for our white students and our non-Pell students over this time period, but they've gone up much more for our students of color and for our low-income students, disproportionately so. The second benefit to this approach, I think, is it eliminates the stigma, right? That when you come to Georgia State and you get supported by these kind of initiatives, it's not because you're a first generation or low income student, it's because you're a Georgia State student. And I think over time, that has made the students much more receptive and accepting of these specialized programs and approaches. The third and final advantage, I would say, is it's cheaper. It's efficient to deliver these programs at scale, in part because once they become the Georgia State way we do things, all advising is done proactively using data. All seniors are subject to these microgrants and so forth. All incoming students have the chatbot. It lowers the cost, technology and implementation costs of delivering that service to any one student. And so it's become a positive ROI for Georgia State. In fact, one of the most surprising findings of Georgia State's trajectory over the last 10 years is the Gates Foundation paid for Boston Consulting Group to do some ROI studies of these programs. What they found about our microgrant program, even though we've given 19,000 grants out over the last eight or so years, is that it's generated more revenue for the university than it's cost. By holding on to these students who in the past were walking away from the university and getting them to the point of graduation, it actually has produced more revenue than it's cost us. So there's a great efficiency to the scale that comes with some of these programs as well.
Great. If you all want to use the raise hand function, we have time for a few questions. If people would like to pose questions to Tim about the work that's happening at GSU. Nathan.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this, Tim. And I was really interested going on your website to look at some of the pillars. The one that I'm really interested in is in the predictive analytics, and wondering if you could talk a little bit about what factors you see have the greatest impact in terms of time to degree and retention and graduation rates. I mean, is it failure to register or taking courses out of sequence, or is it very course specific, getting a bad test score and intervening then?
Yeah, the largest impacts are the former, and that's good news for all of us because we have a fancy analytics platform. It doesn't take necessarily a fancy analytics platform to make a big difference. So what we saw, and this was back 2011 or so, is that we were losing about almost 6,000 students a year to drop out. These were students who were not dropping out for financial reasons and who were academically qualified. They just didn't re-enroll. And so we wanted to find a way to identify who these students were before they dropped out, on the premise that if we could know why they were likely to drop out, we might be able to stop it from happening. So we did a big data project. We used 10 years of our data, 2.5 million Georgia State grades. The point of the data project was really simple. Could we find any recurring academic behaviors that correlated in a statistically significant way to students dropping or flunking out of Georgia State? We thought we'd find a few dozen. We actually found more than 800. So that's what we've been doing, is every day since August 2012. So I guess we've hit now over 8 years, tracking every student every night. As we update all our information systems, we're looking for any of those behaviors. What we found, and we've had literally about 700,000 interventions over that time period now, we're averaging now about 100,000 a year, is that the most common interventions and the most impactful interventions are over the simplest issues, right? A critical issue for our students is signing up for the right classes in the right order. One of the things that's happened since we've launched this system is we've cut the average time to a bachelor's degree down by over half a semester per student. Not because we've lowered any graduation requirements, just because we're finally monitoring whether students are registering for the right classes. Every semester, we're finding during the registration period, there are over 3,000 students who are signing up for classes that would not advance their graduation requirements in the least. So do no good towards their graduation requirements. Sadly, in the past, 3,000 of those students would have been allowed to pay for and take these courses. And in some cases, they're courses that are not a good fit for the student academically, so they result in low grades as well. Now we're catching that in advance. Really simple stuff. When I present to external audiences, they say, oh, weren't you always doing that, making sure your students were signing up for the right classes every semester? And the answer at most big institutions like Georgia State, of course, is no. We're looking at students who withdraw in the middle of the semester. Talk about an early alert. You don't need a fancy analytic for that one. A student signed up and paid for a class, and they're withdrawing from it in the middle of the semester. But how many of our institutions actually intervene with that student immediately? I mean, within 8 hours, 12 hours after they withdraw from the course. I sure know that Georgia State wasn't doing so for decades. We've started to do that now because an alert goes off. But if ever a student was raising their hand saying, I'm in distress, it's a student who's paid for a course and is in a course and dropping it in the middle of the semester. They're either financially or personally or academically overwhelmed. Let's try to figure out what that is. And even the academic indicators are really simple ones. The most potent and predictive indicator of a student graduating on time academically is the first grade they get in their major. You know, a student who gets an A or B in their first political science course and is a political science major is graduating from Georgia State on time at about a 75% clip. A student who gets a C in their first political science course and is a political science major is graduating on time from Georgia State at a 25% clip. But we'd never done anything with that C student until we introduced this kind of outreach. So the good thing, the promising thing about these examples is these are data points in the arsenal of every single campus. You know, you don't need to go and spend $500,000 with a vendor to know which courses a student needs to take for their major, whether they're dropping or withdrawing a course in the middle of the semester, what their first grade was in their major. But these indicators have huge predictive value. We as a sector have not used that. And interestingly enough, I do a lot of speaking publicly. Recently, I've spoken twice at Harvard, I've spoken at Duke, I've spoken at Yale, I've spoken at Vanderbilt. These elite schools are now realizing they don't do enough systematic monitoring of these kind of indicators. And their graduation rates may be 93%, but you could get it up to 96% and maybe eliminate equity gaps if you started paying more attention to these type of data.
Great, thanks. Are there other questions? You have time for about one more. Oh, there's two. Okay, well, let's go with Michael.
Thank you. And thank you, Tim. I actually heard you speak a few years ago at San Diego State for the graduation initiative. So this is nice to actually be able to ask questions this time. So I looked at the data and the website, and after even seeing your presentation a few years ago, one of the questions that I had is that, I mean, clearly this helped a lot of students and closed equity gaps, but there's still problem areas that still have to be there, right? So how are you still trying to address these problem areas? So once you get to this point of using artificial intelligence, of providing these supports, what is your next step after that to still be able to advance student success?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. This is definitely an iterative process that does not have any end, right? It never will have any end. What we're doing is continuing to use data in the same way we were 10 years ago to identify where our biggest stumbling blocks and issues are. We've had real challenges with our student body that is a majority low income, with getting them to complete forms on time, FAFSA in on time, verification requirements, and so forth. So we've recently moved to a new model. We now have a platform that allows students to submit all their documents via the same kind of take a picture of the document that you do to submit a check to your bank. Now they can submit their verification records and so forth that way. And we're able to turn around when documents are missing. What used to take 2 or 3 weeks, we can often do within a couple hours now. The chatbot that we started with just for our incoming freshmen, our incoming students during the summer before they first enroll, has been so effective that this fall, for the first time, all Georgia State undergraduates have this tool throughout their academic career. It took us a couple of years to build up the knowledge base of this chatbot so it could answer all the questions that students have even after they enroll. But the idea is these same sorts of investments become increasingly impactful if you find ways to spread them and advance them across the whole student body. Another big initiative we have right now is something called College to Career, where we are embedding career readiness experiences in the students' curriculum, starting their very first semester, then in what we're calling gateway classes, the first introductory course they take in their major, then in a capstone course, so that the students can be exploring career issues, major specific, throughout their academic careers. And this is an attempt to prepare our students better for post-graduation outcomes.
Great. Last question is going to be from Haley.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing about these practices. I'm a process dork, so that's where my question is coming from. I'm wondering if you can share a bit about how students were engaged as decision makers in shaping some of these policies. I think that's important from an equity lens. I'd just love to hear any best practices you have to share.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I guess I'll give a twofold answer. That as we were implementing these platforms, we have specifically sought out targeted student input. So for instance, when we launched our predictive analytics back in 2012 in advising, we equipped all advisors with a second monitor on their in their offices, so that, and made a pledge to the students and live up to it to this day, that the students can see anything that the advisors can. There's no private notes or data about our students. This is an attempt to empower students and allow them to understand the meaning of their own performance relative to historical markers and so forth. And then we set up iPads at the time. Now we have a code scan that the students use when they leave the advising office. But at the time we set up iPads in the office, and every student completed as they left the advising session a quick survey about what did you like, what did you not like, and so forth. Interestingly, the most common reaction we got when we launched that platform back in 2012 is, where was this when I first enrolled? The students do feel empowered when they can sit there. If you're a nursing major and pre-nursing major trying to get into the nursing program and haven't done well in chemistry, the students appreciated knowing, okay, these are kind of the odds I'm up against. These are the tools and the supports I might need to access if I'm to increase my probabilities. So that's one way, and I think it's very important. But I do want to emphasize a second way, and it's been very important during COVID, which is the very use of data in the drill down and a kind of systematic way that Georgia State has emphasized gives voice to students who we would never hear from. So just one quick example is, you know, we set up 2 pathways for students to get emergency aid at the end of March. This is when we were pivoting online, and you know, COVID was hitting Georgia most dramatically. One was fill out a form, an application, submit an application for emergency aid. And over the last 5, now almost 6 months, we've had over 3,000 students raise their hand and say, yeah, I need aid because I'm having food insecurity, housing insecurity, I need technology to access my courses and so forth. We've had over 30,000 students get the emergency aid grants from Georgia State. Why? Because we were tracking every student for levels of unmet need, for expected family contribution, for holds, financial holds they had on their account. And we were not waiting for the students to raise their hand, because every time you create a bureaucratic hoop like that, we have this aid for you, but you need to find the right website, you need to fill out the form, you need to apply, and then you need to wait for 10 days. Not only will you only serve a subset of the students, you will serve a subset of the students that are disproportionately empowered, right? It will be the students who are best connected, who find the way to get that aid. And so one of the things Georgia State believes very strongly is we need to use the data to give voice to students who otherwise do not come into our offices, do not raise their hand, do not speak up. That's what our predictive analytics do. Whether the student self-diagnoses that withdrawing from this course puts them at risk, we are going to notice this and reach out to the student. That's what our financial aid initiatives do. In the sense that in many instances, like our retention grants, they don't require any application. We're going to notice when you're in financial distress and try to reach out to the students. This has been a crucial part, I believe, of us being able to eliminate most equity gaps, including equity gaps based on race, ethnicity, and income level, by not making the access to aid a bureaucratic staff that only a subset of the students can navigate.
Tim, I want to say thank you for being in the hot seat for the beginning of our meeting.
My pleasure.
To really get an opportunity to hear a lot more about the way in which you all have been using predictive analytics and data to really center students and all students, obviously, in ways, though, that help to promote equity. So we're really grateful for that. We are going to go on to our agenda. Just one note before we move into it, and I pass things off to Susan, which is we've had some inquiries from all of you about how we should be thinking about communications relative to the task force. And so I wanted to let you know that we are in the process of finalizing some guidance for each of you, or for you collectively, about how we should be communicating about the task force and some of the work that we are doing. At a general level, I think we want to encourage you to talk with your friends and your colleagues and your stakeholders about the work that is happening here. But I think that what we are trying to do is make sure that we hold the integrity of the conversations that we are having. And so in that respect, I think we are saying definitely the big picture issues, if people want to, share their views with you, that's fine. But when it comes to thinking about conclusions and recommendations, that we really try to hold those conversations for the conversation that's going to happen between us, because we will be kind of forming those together as a part of the blueprint that we're trying to put together. So definitely feel like you can invite folks to share with you their views, but we want to make sure that we're holding the integrity of the process in terms of the conversations that we are having. We have some stuff that will be shared with you in written form, just so that you all know exactly how we're thinking about it, and how we should be thinking about it in terms of the timing. What's happening now is going to be very different than what happens in 4 months when we actually have a blueprint out. So I just wanted to give you all a heads up on that piece. And with that, I will then turn it to Susan. And thank you again, Tim.
A great way to kick it off. It gave us a lot of energy and ideas, Tim, and we appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'm going to pull you through a couple of things, and first citing where we are in this process and how we're accomplishing the work. So why don't you go ahead and flip to the next slide. All right, so and I think we need to go back to slide 3, Colette, because we did a little bit of a switcheroo in the agenda. And I wanted to just build on some of the things that Tim was talking about, and that leans into some of the work that Sean has been doing, and so generously shared an article with us that hits on some of these same notes, is that part of what we want to do in this process is to be intentionally using an equity by design process. The thought being that our current systems have been perfectly designed to do what they do. And if we have racism and other structural barriers built into our systems right now, we can choose to intentionally design them so that they are equitable. But to do so, we need to do something that Haley mentioned earlier, which is how is it that we are listening to the most critical stakeholders and the voices that aren't always folded into the process in a regular way. And so how we're going to do that is we're going to be using a user-centered design in some places and a co-design process in other places. And so we'll point that out to you as we go along. but in many ways, what we are doing is listening deeply to the voices of stakeholders in the region, as well as across the state, and integrating stakeholders like students, institutional leads, workforce folks, both on this team and in our research. And it's only by listening to the authentic voices of the people who are experiencing the challenge or who are most proximate to the problem that we are most likely to have solutions that are going to address the root causes that they are experiencing. So that we're going about this in a little bit different way. Go ahead and please flip the slide over. So to do this, we're going to use basically a process that's been designed by Christina Ortiz at Equity Meets Design, and we have worked with her to adapt this for a variety of purposes, including the use here. And so basically what we're doing is we're going to be presenting some information on empathy today. You know, what did we hear from these stakeholders? How is it that they spoke to us about what they're experiencing? We're going to use that to define the problem through the eyes and through the lenses of those people most proximate to the problem. It's not a perfect process because we're not having users do the design, but it's much closer and much more authentic to being able to get where we want to go. We're going to spend some time lingering in that problem, and so it's going to make you a little bit uncomfortable. We're going to challenge you to look through other people's lenses and to define that problem directly. At that point, we're going to move later in the process into a develop and concept ideation phase and into a prototype and testing phase. Each of those things are going to iterate on each other, right? It's not going to be a direct line. And one of the things that we are going to do as we move into the ideation and prototyping and testing phase is we're going to go back to those users that you're going to hear about today, and we're going to test those solutions with them and say, have we gotten it right? If so, where? Have we gotten it wrong? And if so, what do we need to do to make it better? So we're going to do that throughout the process. And I just wanted to let you know that that's where we're entering. That's why you're going to see the data that you're going to see today, and why we're going to pull you through the process that we're going to have a little bit later in the conversation. So Colette, if you could skip us over to slide 9, please. That would be lovely. And we're going to talk a little bit about the statewide data that you were sent and pull you through what's it that you all are going to do on this group. So what we're going to do today is we're going to really define the equity challenge by examining the research and the data that we have so far. And we are going to make sure that we are listening carefully to what we're hearing and starting to dissect that and dive into root causes. We're going to have a subset of data for you to deal with today that we sent to you last night, so no worries if you haven't fully digested that yet. But we're going to use that data and the statewide data to do that. Then we're going to move through and put some work groups in place and engage some technical experts in that defining of success and the barriers and the mitigation and creating some solutions. We're going to then, in the October timeframe, continue that work group and reflect on the effects and the potential solutions. And then finally, when we go back and look at the ones that we most want to include in a recommendation set, we are going to make sure that we put those in scenarios that we check back with users before we go forward with putting those recommendations in place. So any questions on kind of that overall arc of a process? All right. I'm going to run through a couple of these data slides, and Colette, I'm going to go pretty quickly because I know that everybody on here got the state level data last week and have probably spent time with that already, but just some headlines. So I'm going to move through pretty quickly. We could go to slide 13. Certainly it's important. We know California is the largest state in the country, a highly diverse population with 63% people of color and significant shift in population that you've experienced over the last number of years with a lot more Latinx population and students in your midst. On the next slide, we also know that California has some challenges, right? You've got the 5th, I think it's the slide before, Colette, you've got the 5th highest unemployment rate in the nation. And in some of your regions of California, it's nearly double that. And people of color and people in poverty are disproportionately hit by those numbers. And so those numbers are continuing to shift with COVID. We've done our best to gather information that was active in July at a regional basis, and that is continuing to shift. So those numbers on a daily basis could look a little bit different, unfortunately. On the next slide, we also know that even though that unemployment rate is fairly high, that the jobs that are available and the jobs that are growing require an associate or a bachelor's degree, or at the least a workforce credential. And California has some work to do in order to gain in the numbers of people who have credentials and degrees to be able to fill the majority of the growing jobs that you have in your state. On the next slide, we also know that the vast majority of students who are seeking degrees and credentials are entering in your community college system. 72% of the Latinx students who are entering post-secondary education are entering through the community college, as compared to 65% of the folks that are entering in California overall. And on the next slide, it's also clear to us that we have about a third of the students in your schools are over 25 years old, right? Who have different needs than a traditional 18-year-old student. And they're overrepresented in our community colleges as well as in for-profit institutions across the state. And then on the next slide, we also know that the lowest income Californians end up spending a significantly higher percentage of their own funds on attending college. And we can talk about why that is, but in general, what it means is that because of the extra costs that they may have, they are spending more proportionately, and they're receiving less support overall if they're a returning adult in particular, because of the way support programs are functioned, financial support programs are structured. And then finally, we know some of the barriers that are and have been in place in California that include everything from limited seats and the low number of students who actually, when they are referred through a CSU program, land at another campus that we can trace, limited course availability at colleges and universities when students need to take them, can extend their time in class. The financial aid challenges are real as we go forward, and thinking about the number of clear pathways that students can easily access to and through higher education. There's a good deal of work already in place, but a lot more work that needs to be done to make that easy for students to navigate. There's also motivational barriers, and we're going to talk about that when we look at some of the new data that we're getting from the interviews that we're doing in the state and the impact that COVID is having on students' attitudes right now. And we know that intersegmentally, it is very difficult for students to navigate transfer and articulation and move from one system to the next. There's some programs in place intended to support them, but even those are not fully understood by students, and it's hard to navigate. And finally, we have a lack of statewide data systems for higher education. You're going to see some holes in the data that we're going to show you today, and you're going to say, where is that data? Where is this data? Unlike some other states, California just doesn't benefit yet from a state data system that allows us to easily pull data and to look at the trends and interrupt some of the cycles and think about solutions in the ways that others might. So I'm going to pause for a moment before I go into the regional data and invite you to either ask questions for a couple of moments or anything that you'd like to clarify in the state level data that you were sent. And then I'm going to go into the regional data and we'll connect some dots there. Somebody, I saw a hand raised go up. Oh, Haley.
It's like Haley. I think it's Haley.
Hi there. I just wanted to raise the language of motivational barriers, I think might benefit from some tweaking. I think the way it's phrased currently places the responsibility on students when it might actually be more productive to talk about systemic barriers and those lack of supports. I just wanted to flag that language. And then at the bottom of the slide, I was also thinking through whether or not it's just a lack of a data system for higher ed, or if there also could be better connections with our K-12 data systems that might help us better support students. So I just wanted to raise those two thoughts about this slide, and I appreciate you soliciting our feedback.
Thanks, Haley. I appreciate that, and we can absolutely make that tweak. And I'm not sure if that was our mistake or if that was something that we pulled directly from other materials, but we'll make sure that gets amended. We don't ever want to blame students for what's going on right here. We want to figure out how to remove barriers that exist. And then I think the second is, yes, the K-12 connection matters a lot, and many states have figured out how is it they can have a clean data system. Well, clean is relative speaking, a good data system that runs from early childhood all the way through to the workforce. Nathan.
Thanks. The other point I'd make is just sort of a nuance, and the financial aid is insufficient. You know, when I was at Merced, 74% of our students are first generation, 65% Pell. And I'd spend time with students trying to understand why financial aid was not working for them. And I think we have to think about it much more holistically. A lot of them actually send money back home. They were part of their family's livelihood. They feel a lot of guilt about being away. And so they would, if anything was given in a cash aid, they would actually send part of it home. And so even if it was sufficient, I think we have to think about the family and what they're going through.
I appreciate that, and I think that it's probably the both and. It's what you've mentioned, and it's also the additional costs that, in particular, older students or students who experience poverty might have. Paying for childcare, making sure that they can pay for food while they are on the road, a variety of different things, and then the challenges that might come with, as a returning student or a student who stopped out, can I still take full advantage of both state and federal financial aid that are there? So I appreciate you raising that, Nathan. Thank you. Michelle?
Thanks, Susan. I agree with Haley's point, so just want to put an exclamation point on that. I also think it's important to not just highlight limited seats at the CSU. The reality is that there's limited seats at the UC, that the UC can say that it accepts all eligible students, but we know that huge redirection to UC Merced, in fact, is happening, of which only 2% or less actually take up that offer, and that the eligibility bar has increased for university enrollment substantially since the 90s. So I feel like we're kind of just accepting that reality instead of saying, hey, in the 1990s, you could get into UC San Diego, as I did, with a 3.5 GPA. That's almost impossible to do today.
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate that. Daisy?
Hey, Susan. Something that I didn't see, and maybe it's getting at the root causes, which we'll have a conversation about later, but on page 24, at least in our system, community colleges, one of the things that we've tackled and that we are working on is aligning the way that we fund our campuses to the outcomes that we wish to see. And that's the student-centered funding formula. And I think it is both the root cause, but I think it should also be reflected on this page.
Thank you. Thank you. We can make that happen. Lauren?
Good morning, and thank you. I wanted to indicate that based on the 2018 data, where you've indicated that the CSU had about 32,000 denied eligible students, that if you look 1 year after that, that number had decreased down to about 26,000 students. Now, don't get me wrong, that's still a large number, but the reality is that a lot of the work that we are doing, certainly modeled after what was done at Georgia State, is starting to take effect. And so we hope that even for this year, as our numbers become clearer, that we will see that number has reduced even more. The last point I want to make is that with a number of these students, they only have one campus in mind. And so if they are not entering that one campus then they have no desire to be redirected or to even give thought to another CSU. And so we've done a whole lot of work there to try to make sure that we're enticing them, that if one campus isn't open to them, that we have availability at our other campuses. But oftentimes those students, if they aren't accepted into the very one that they want, then they make choices outside of the CSU.
Thank you. And thank you for also putting the report in the chat for us, Lauren. I appreciate that. Michael.
Thank you. I was just looking at some of the data and wondering whether you all were looking at intersectionalities at all. So as in, you know, men of color, women of color, or homeless youth, Black homeless youth, and trying to combine some of those data elements to see if some of those intersectionalities are impacted a lot more heavily.
Thank you for that question, Michael. What we've done so far is that we have prioritized in the focus groups Black students, Latinx students, and returning adults. We have not gotten to the point of intersectionality with the data at this point, but we focused on those top 3 priorities that the group discussed last time. And so we haven't gotten to that intersectionality piece yet. My hope is that we can. And so it is likely that in the solution building and the scenarios that's where we're really going to be digging in there. We have a limited opportunity for research and focus groups. So, you know, I wish we could do everything. I'm not sure how far we'll get, but we're going to make our best pitch at it. And then Bridget, and then Londe, and then we're going to keep moving.
I just want to underscore what Michelle said earlier, because that was my feedback about the CSU being the only entity that's not growing. But I also just want to flag, because I see how other states can go down. Is my audio weird? Okay, I can fix it.
You're fine.
I see other states go down a path with little miniature microphone. I see some states go down this path where there are some assumptions in their design constraints that you need to call out, which is that you are assuming seat time. That the word seat is itself a design consideration. It is an assumption. And I would encourage you to think more creatively than that. Just know that you're making an assumption that it's about, that it has to be physical. It's making an assumption about which campuses should grow versus others, and that it shouldn't just all grow. And then also you're not thinking about other things like, you know, time things are offered, things like that. And the other part is that as you read through many of the prep materials, we definitely heard that the online experience right now is subpar for many students. We know that's true, not necessarily, that's not a California problem. But I would say that in California, online feels like a second class experience, because it was thought of as secondarily. It was not thought of intentionally as something that should be designed explicitly. And especially that's a place where we can be more creative and more intentional about, you know, nobody wanted Zoom U. But in the future, that should be a part of our conception of what we do when it comes to the word seat.
Appreciate that, Bridget. Thank you. Thank you. And then we've got Londe, and I think Gabby had her hand up too. So Londe, did you have something you wanted to?
Yes, 2 quick things. On the financial aid inadequacy question, I think some of the nuance I would add to that is financial aid is inadequate in 2 ways. One is in terms of state financial aid, it doesn't account for those 1/3 of students who are older. And so there are ways that state financial aid really privileges younger students, and it's inadequate in particular for that population. I think the other piece around financial aid is financial aid oftentimes, particularly for community college students, does not really account for their living expenses. So we have financial aid that takes care of their fees, which by national standards are nominal here in California. Not that they're insignificant for students, but relative to the nation, they are not significant. But many of those students do not get the kind of supports for living expenses, which then drives them to work extraordinary numbers of hours, then elongate time to degree. So it ends up being this chain reaction. And so I would say that our financial aid program which is actually quite robust at $2.5 billion relative to any other state, has some challenges in terms of how we think about who has eligibility relative to the population, as well as whether or not we're actually encouraging and supporting students at different segments, such as the community colleges, to apply for Pell and to do some of those other things that they may need to live. The second piece, it was at the bottom. Oh, in terms of the longitudinal data system, we definitely have challenges there. And the state is, I just want to note, we're in the process of developing a statewide longitudinal data system that will go from early childhood all the way through early workforce. So while we don't have that now, that was an explicit priority of the governors that we have been working on this entire year.
Thank you, Londe. And we're going to hear from, I think, Gabby. Yes, hear from Gabby. And then we're going to move on to the regional data so that we can have a look at that.
I just wanted to ask if we could, as we move forward, there's been some good data, well, good and bad data about the New York Pathways program between the community colleges and the state colleges, where they did a realignment of the entire curriculums for all of the schools. It'd be nice to see how that's working.
Great, thank you. We're going to have a more discussion as soon as we get through the look at the regional data. And so, Deborah, let's pick you up at that point and connect some of these dots that we're talking about so that we can make sure that that we're really moving forward. And I'm hearing you on affordability. That's a much better way to describe what we're talking about here because costs are real, but they are not all direct costs of college. They're also important indirect costs of living and what it takes to make all of this come together for students. All right, Colette, if you could put up the first regional data slide, that would be important, which is going to be slide 21. As we go through this regional data, a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that we know that COVID is disproportionately impacting Black, brown, and poor students all over the country and in the state of California. That it's undeniable. And we know that COVID has fundamentally disrupted the education process and the process for each of us in our work lives and in our home lives. And so that's going to have an impact, you know, going forward. It's going to be irrefutable, but something that we will continue to learn from and see more data about as we go forward. So as we learn more about that, heading through this fall, we'll do our best to keep an eye on it as we move ahead. About this regional data, we are sharing with you data about the Inland Empire because we've conducted all of those interviews and had an opportunity to analyze that data. We are in the midst of either finishing up interviews in the other 4 regions and or analyzing that data. So we're looking at a subset. We will have a full set for each region for you when we meet again in October, and we'll send that to you in advance. And we will be feeding that information into the work groups as we get started on work groups moving forward. So I wanted to let you know that. So the other thing to know is that we have been able to, as a team at Education First, pull together and compare notes about the headlines of what we are seeing across our regions. And so you'll see some of that reflected in the data that I'm going to go over now. We'll do the Inland Empire first, and then we'll talk about what are some of the state kind of preliminary headlines that we are seeing, even before we get to that formal full-on analysis. All right. So Inland Empire, the data here, pieces that we know is it's trailing the average of the state in both educational attainment and A through G completion. No surprise there. And as we go to the next slide, we also know that there are only 2 of the fastest growing occupations in the Inland Empire require post-secondary education. Now that's as the data is spelled out generally for us, but there are other fast growing jobs in the region that we can look at. But it raises the question, you know, what are the jobs that these students are looking to take? And are the jobs that are growing the fastest in this region the ones that are going to offer a family sustaining wage and career growth over time? So there's also the distribution of the undergraduates in this area. There's a lot of community college uptake, significant community college uptake, particularly overrepresentation of adult students in the community college segment. That's really mirroring what we're seeing in the rest of the state as well. You can go ahead and flip, Colette. So just gives you a snapshot of the demographic information. But our conversations in the Inland Empire are really helping us to understand a variety of different themes, and we're going to dig into these, and then we're going to try to connect some of these dots. So education is a priority, but the way that students are thinking about the value proposition of post-secondary education is shifting. That became very clear. There's a perception that funding and capacity is restraining equitable approaches to policy and practice for system stakeholders. I think we need to examine that more deeply. Displaced workers are requiring innovative training solutions during this time of economic change. The role of higher education is evolving, and leaders are exploring strategies to better address students' basic needs, and in some places are conflicted around the role that the institution needs to play. There is some inflexibility that we had heard through the system that is really causing some challenge for students, and particularly around intersegmental collaboration, how institutions are working together to help students get where they need to go. We know that COVID has absolutely exposed the cracks and exacerbated the digital divide, both in the availability of devices and the availability and the affordability of internet connection. And then our higher ed institutions transition to online learning has left students feeling less supported. We don't lay that at the feet of faculty who have done their best to make a very quick pivot in the springtime, but the reality is that that's how students are expressing their experience. Let's go ahead and flip to the next slide. So what does this look like as we dig in a little bit? And before we go too far, I would love to just, on a ranking of 1 to 5, 1 being I could recite it, you know, Bible and verse, or 1 being I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. Put a number in the chat for me in terms of how deeply you've been able to look at the materials that were sent last night. So 5 if you know it by heart, and 1 if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. Just throw a number in the chat if you could. Great, that's helpful, thank you. All right, so we'll spend a little bit of time digging in, but it sounds like most people had an opportunity to really read this, and we appreciate you doing that. So the students, let me talk a little bit about who we interviewed while we were there, and I want to also invite Carl to weigh in with any color commentary because he did these interviews in the Inland Empire. But we talked with institutional leaders, we talked with students, we talked with workforce representatives, we talked with P16 cradle to career folks who are working on that connection points. We talked with some K-12 folks as well. And so I think that it's important to know that as a result of what we are seeing, we probably need to connect with some additional people as well. And we have that on the list, including doing focus group of more faculty members, and we'll include faculty members as members of work groups when their expertise is in the area that we're exploring. So wanted to let you know who we have and haven't spoken to. So post-secondary choices based on shifting value proposition. You know, students are becoming more skeptical of the value proposition of higher education and the current quality of online learning. It's not that they think it's unimportant. It's that they wonder if the price that they are paying and the experience they're getting in an online environment is really the right value proposition. And there are concerns about specific fees and things of that nature, but also concerns about, am I getting an experience that connects me to my peers? Am I getting an experience that provides relationship with faculty members? Am I getting an experience where I, as a learner, am able to grasp the material and get the supports that I need? There's also, we heard a lot about limited funding and capacity. So about funding inequity and budget cuts exacerbating current challenges, right? Tight margins and limited capacity on the part of institutions is what institutions were describing. And we also heard about the ability to redesign through the eyes of institutional leaders seems constrained in the post-secondary system. I think we need to interrogate that more deeply, but system leaders are feeling their hands are a bit tied, but knowing that there are systemic barriers in place right now. And they recognize that the system is not equitably funded upon all of the outcomes that we need to go, that we need to really focus on. All right, go ahead and flip to the next slide. There is also a real need for short-term flexible credentialing programs linked to existing and emerging jobs, and a recognition that they need to be more flexible than ever before to allow individuals who are displaced and who also have additional COVID burdens, like caring for family in ways that they didn't have to care about family before, or being in new or different circumstances, that they really need that kind of quick, supported programming that's flexible for them to take, that does not take 2 years to complete, does not take, that can be in bite-sized chunks. And so it is one of the things that we heard significantly within the region. And then the institutional role. I think higher education is challenged by the evolving role of the institution, including how they're attending to advancing social justice and equity reforms, but not just that. I think that some institutions have long understood that they needed to be able to provide connection points and supports to students around mental health and food insecurity and other issues that students experience that will keep them in school or drive them from school because they have to pay attention to these other elements of their life. And some institutions are not at all used to doing that work and perplexed about what is the main role that we need to play there and how can we best play it and what are the pivots that we need to make in order to do so. And I'm not sure, and Carl, I'd invite you to comment on this, about anything that you could add any color commentary there about the conflicts that you heard about that role.
It was, I think it was a true embrace of the realities of what students are facing. So it was not a question of like why or what. The question was really like how. Like they were acknowledging the need to respond immediately and to pivot, and that a lot of these issues, while COVID kind of elevated the intensity, had long been issues for, you know, years upon years. I think the question was knowing that COVID makes inequities much more clear and the depth of the lack of kind of system-wide infrastructure to support that is really, you know, very clear. The question was just like how to maintain that model moving forward and acknowledging that more is being asked of institutions to serve multiple social, mental, you know, relationship supports, like basic needs. The question was really just, hey, like that really isn't necessarily the model that we've built as an operating model. And so what's realistic for that? And how can institutions do it in a sustainable way while still meeting the evolving needs of students over time?
Thanks, Carl. Why don't you go to the next slide, Colette? So the notion of, you know, the policies that might be in the way, the flexibility that students need, access and convenience that can make their experiences more streamlined and affordable were really important and came up a lot from students. Transfer, even the you know, transfer to degree program is very confusing for students. They don't know how to access it, even those who are eligible for it. It's not clear to them how to make their way from one system to the next, or to swirl their classes in a way that would allow them to really have an affordable experience. They want more dynamic workforce-based learning with experiential built in. And I think someone was describing earlier today how they're trying to bake in some of the career-ready pieces in career exploration. There's a hunger for that. And really thinking outside of the box about how can we expand students' ability to get more students through the A through G in advance of entering the system. And then finally, the digital divide here on this slide was really, really important to know. It's devices, it's access to internet, it's cost of internet, and even though colleges in the spring had done their very best job to try to pivot and hack their way into getting students access, when there's multiple family members in a household learning in different systems, they can easily overwhelm the bandwidth of a Wi-Fi hotspot. They may not have the multiple devices they need for each learner to be able to do what they need to do, and the learning conditions obviously may not be the same. So I think it's important to know that it's not just its availability, it's pricing, it's bandwidth, it's a variety of those things that can interfere with the learning process. And then as we look at the next slide, this transition to online is not just about getting online, it's about learning online, and it's about connecting online, and it's about understanding what's happening in the classroom and making that personal connection to professors, to their classmates, and having a college experience that helps to amplify the learning that's there. Students mentioned in particular that they're not sure that their professors were ready to help them through an online experience, which is not a surprise because many professors haven't done that before. That's not been their mode of operation for years. And so I think it's important for us to understand that many students' experiences are colored by that first experience of a faculty member, and we probably need to provide additional support for that going forward for our faculty members. And we want to spend some more time talking with and understanding faculty needs as we go forward as stakeholders themselves as well. All right, so given what we've learned, what are some of the likely implications? And I'm going to refer all of you to slides 28 through 30 because this is really where we're going to kind of dig in on some of the meat going forward. Digital equity, student engagement, course delivery, enrollment uncertainty. And when I say enrollment uncertainty, the shifting value proposition is causing students, no doubt, those of you who work in institutions are already seeing this and tracking it daily, they're enrolling in different institutions. They're deferring when they're choosing to enroll for a year. Some of them are choosing not to go at all because they want to wait this out, whatever that looks like. But we know when students wait it out and have a gap, that they're less likely to graduate the longer that gap goes on. So those are some of the big issues that we found. Transfer improvements are necessary, and online instruction supports and engagement are important. So that kind of wraps up the region. One more thing before I open it up is that on slide 32, Colette, the interviews and the focus groups that we are doing across the state, the preliminary headlines are very similar to what we've seen in the Inland Empire. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but this notion of existing inequalities being absolutely exacerbated it just couldn't be more visceral. From 11 people living in an apartment because of loss of homes, and having 6 learners in a current environment to be able to manage what's going on from K-12 through higher ed. All the way to the food insecurity and the lack of internet, the digital divide, very real. And the funding and the budgets are exacerbating existing financial challenges and in the inequities within the system of higher ed that are already there. So I think it's important for us to just recognize and I'm sure that many of you do, the very serious everyday challenges that are placed on folks, not just within the institutions, but beyond the institutions, that can sometimes really layer one on top of another. On slide 33, the connection between higher ed and workforce really needs to be strengthened. This notion of how quickly can we retrain people to be able to get them into a career or a job, having lost one, that is now available in the COVID environment. Increasing the flexibility of the higher ed system and changing some of those systemic pieces that exist right now, as Tim talked about, not just thinking about individual programs, but thinking about the systemic barriers that are in place, even if they were not intended to be barriers. Sometimes they are. And then this value proposition question is very real, and students are acting on it now, and so we need to better understand it. And then finally on slide 34, it's more difficult to do some of the work without the right data systems in place with which to do it. And so I know that there's a plan to try to pull some things together. Do we have 5 years to wait for that to happen and to come to fruition? And then what are the long-term impacts of the inequities that we're seeing today, that of students making choices now? What is that going to look like in 5 years? What is going to be the impact of this year to 2 years to 3 years of COVID that we're experiencing, and students and families making a variety of choices? So what do we need to do? So I'm going to stop talking because it's now time for you all to weigh in and challenge what we have, ask and connect dots, ask questions, and look for, what do we make of this data? And I'm seeing Michael and then Gabby. Michael, what question do you have?
Thank you. I'm from the Inland Empire, so I have a lot of thoughts about data that I'm looking at here. And I'll actually have a lot of questions as well about, what kind of folks were you talking to? How did you solicit some of the responses? I know that the Inland Empire is a very diverse region, so the responses that you get from someone in Riverside or San Bernardino or Redlands is very different than someone from like Palm Springs or Palm Desert or one of the other regions. So I'm really curious, what methodology did you use?
Great. Do you want to take that one, Carl, since you were the one that was in the room?
Sure. Yeah, like you, Michael, I live in the IE as well. So I was really excited and happy to lead this. So with our student groups, we intentionally worked with organizations that just some of the leaders in the field had acknowledged as folks that were really connected with just very real students that were, like college going, hardworking, but didn't necessarily represent like anything that didn't represent what a normal student would be facing. So all of our students that we talked with were either African American or Latinx, and we worked with groups that primarily serve students in the San Bernardino area, and also students that worked and had a lot of connections to folks in the Riverside area. And so what we just tried to do was just go with the established, strong kind of regional organizations that we knew. And, it's very, very clear who those folks were. And just ask them big questions about who was the organizations that were best connected to communities and who had the strong relationships with students that were not only going to college, but also helping them, supporting them, their work leading up to college. And beyond that, we cast a very wide net in terms of other stakeholders, whether that was all of the chancellors and presidents of, all the major community colleges and 4 institutions in the area, all the K-12 county superintendents, as well as some of the superintendents in some of the bigger districts, and also got really in depth with a wide range of workforce folks that covered the gamut from, like you said, the high desert to the low desert to everywhere in between. And so we probably talked to well over, 50 people collectively across all the conversations. And a lot of it was just really grounded in, trusting the leadership that's in the Inland Empire and the relationships that we have with them, and making sure that they directed us to the folks that they knew were very connected and very much in tune with the ongoing, well-established regional work that had already been underway across the region. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the one thing to know is that these are empathy-based interviews, which means what we put forward are kind of large questions about what is your experience, what matters to you, what are you considering as you go forward, not are you having problems with the digital divide, right? So we try to mine the stories and of what students have to tell us and what these other stakeholders that Carl described have to tell us to go along with some of the data that we have from known sources.
Do I have time for a quick follow-up?
Really quick.
Okay. I'm really curious, the students that you spoke to, do you know if they were from the Inland Empire or from elsewhere? I think that might make a slight difference, but may not be significant.
I want to say they all lived locally. So I think I'm pretty sure they were local residents. None of them lived on campus. They all lived like at home with their families. So I'm pretty confident they all were at least lived in the area, probably from the area.
Okay. We're going to go to Gabby and then to Bridget.
Thanks. I just wanted to point out two things when we're talking about what are the costs of the choices that students are making and also of the being left behind right now. I said this on to Carl last night, but there's a report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that was 3 years ago, basically showing that if you can increase completion rates by half of what the completion rates are, right? Then what you end up getting is the costs of that increase in completion start to turn around. So the initial investment that the state would have to make or counties would have to make, those costs start to decrease after year 11. And that as you go on, once you are 20 years out, you get an annual gross domestic product growth that is about 10% higher than it is without that completion. So, I mean, it's just it's the people's court. And those costs, not doing them, of course, has the opposite effect, right? Because you aren't having people saving for retirement. You aren't having people able to access loans for homes. So you get not just a depression of GDP, but you get less obvious real wealth. That was my only soapbox. And then my students, we had students who were sending in tickets, help desk tickets for their faculty members because the Zoom wasn't working.
Yeah, absolutely. Bridget?
I really appreciated this document. I went through and last night I was highlighting spaces where I see these are shared challenges with other states. And so there are going to be potentially some solutions that we can leverage from the outside, but there are some that are very specific to California that I think help us narrow our focus. And there are some that are definitely not my expertise. Like I have some questions that I can follow up with later. Like I wanted to know about what would be the implications of expanding Cal Grant to the community colleges. Just I want to actually net see what that would look like. But I did want to add a little nuance to number 6, the value proposition of higher ed changing. What I actually heard from that piece was that short-term implementation of distance learning is that creating negative perception for online in general, which limits potential opportunities if you do decide that online, intentional, well-designed with an equity lens online is going to be one of the strategies that you expand access with. So I would just, it's not really the value prop, it's just short-term implementation, which everyone has, like nobody's living their best life right now. And how can we mitigate that? The connection with workforce as well, that's a universal thing. That plus the student engagement. I'm seeing that in every state. Nobody really knows how to do student-to-student connection. Everyone's trying a multitude of avenues, but it is a thing that is a struggle for everyone. And the connection with workforce, the real question is, how are we setting up the experts in our faculty to have smart conversations, intentional conversations about their discipline areas? where they can be identified very clear changes they anticipate in the future. And what courses should they stop offering? Where is there clearly a place where we need to modularize a class? Where is there a small, because bites, it's not that, yes, we have this broader challenge, but also frankly, a new population we need to serve, our alumni, because our alumni are unemployed, not at the rate of everyone, but therefore they don't need a degree, they don't need an MBA. So what does that look like? And so I think just making sure that we're smart about how do we set, in the midst of COVID, the smart people who already have given their lives to this field up to have smart conversations that actually can help position us for the future. Because obviously in many of the discipline areas, that's not something I should be predicting where jobs are going to go. But we literally have all the smart people working in higher ed, just are trying to figure out how to submit a help desk request.
Right. Thank you. It's incredibly helpful. And I do think it's helpful to know what is universal and what is more specific to California. Really appreciate you sharing what you're seeing across the country. Thank you, Bridget. Keith.
Okay, so I have a couple comments. Can you hear me? All right, perfect. I have a couple comments. So first of all, on page number 2 and page 2 and 3, this kind of highlights the issue that the campaign brought up in their report regards to state of higher education for Black students, regards to the percentage of African Americans or Blacks in the IE and the numbers that are attending a private / for-profit college. And you see 7%, and wait, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think it's the green. Yeah, green. I'm close to it. Okay, yeah, green. But you see the numbers with 11% of the African Americans are attending a for-profit. I think that's a problem, and that goes against the California Master Plan. I think that's something that we really need to take a look at, because why are they going to for-profits? And then in page number 5 kind of gets into it, where the nonprofit leader was talking about the Cal States and the students are not able to get their financial aid. And so I think we really need to look at the number of African American students who are going to for-profits and why they're going to for-profits. California community colleges are cheaper and are better institutions, but why are students going to for-profits over the California community colleges? And then also, how can we streamline the process for student aid? I think that's critical as we move forward. And the reason why we ask students over and over again how poor you are. So from your different categorical programs who have funding for students, from your district funding, you might do emergency grants. We continue to ask so many different applications. Why can't we just have one application for students to be able to receive all the services that are available at a college campus? You have to have students fill out multiple applications, and then they're waiting. And so we really need to figure that out. We continue to ask students over and over again how poor they are. So I'll leave it at that for right now.
Thank you, Keith. Any other comments? I think we have time for one more. Yes.
You know, in my first presidency, I will say I was at a for-profit. I've had 3 college presidencies, and it was a good one. And I will tell you why. The students are treated with respect. They are given a guide and a plan on how to finish the degree and help them get that first career entree into that job. I was in New York City, and there were 7,000 surveys that I used to read every year. And I would always ask that question, why are you coming here and not going to the community college in the City University of New York? And they said that they always see a pathway of getting out, and that they're treated with respect and they're treated well. Good, better, and different. I think we have to learn those lessons at all of our institutions.
Thank you, Mildred. Thank you. So this is the first piece of trying to connect the dots, understanding what stakeholders are saying on the ground in the Inland Empire. We'll have 4 more regional looks as we go forward, but what we're going to do with this data is we're going to move to, after a short break, we're going to move to a conversation that Carl's going to lead us in small groups, where we take what we know today with this data and start to think about how do we use this data to look through the lenses of the stakeholders in the region and create some user statements, user need statements. What do they need? going forward to then get to root causes. I do want to warn you that this is going to be an unsatisfying, not tied up neatly with a bow exercise, but one where we're going to ask you to stretch and really inhabit the skin of someone else to the extent that you can. Because this is the kind of root cause analysis process that we're going to continue to use back at Ed First as we look at this data, and with the work groups as the work group digs in on what are both the root causes and what do some potential solutions need to look like. So we're going to go ahead and take about a 5-minute break. We're going to come back and we're going to put you to work because I know you haven't spoken to each other nearly enough yet, and we want to get that moving. So 5 minutes, leave your Zoom on, turn your cameras off, and go ahead and mute yourselves, and we'll see you at 2:36.
Just a heads up, we have about 1 more minute, and then we'll reconvene and get moving. Okay, folks, we're about right back at time. It's 36 past, so hopefully everyone was able to stretch, bio break, maybe grab a quick snack. By the way, I know it's getting close to lunchtime for some folks, so if you want to grab something to kind of keep powering through, no judgment. Please feel free to do so. So we'll just give folks a few more seconds to hop back on, and then I'll be walking us through the next part of the agenda. It's always pretty funny how fast 5 minutes can go by. Okay, so and I'm, folks are getting themselves situated. So if everyone's not back on video, that's okay. But let's jump back in. So let me pick us up on where we're going next. So as Susan mentioned earlier in the discussion, this meeting really is bridging us from what we're learning and hearing from our early data and stakeholder findings, and then moving us towards how we're going to start to address ways to address those issues that we're uncovering with stakeholders. And so a big part of this meeting that we want to engage you all in is a simple root cause analysis exercise, which allows us to elevate all those important equity implications that are bubbling up from our kind of initial stakeholder discussions, and then trying to use that to translate that into some real specific reasons why those issues exist. And so we want to tap into your good thinking, the collective thinking, by having us work together for the next hour or so to try to uncover that. And so as Susan said, you're gonna feel tempted to just jump to solutions because there's a sense of urgency. This has been going on for so long, and there's lots of challenges that are in front of us. But we want you to take the time of this conversation to try to sit with the problem, because the challenge is when you start to work towards solutions that come from your own personal or your own background and perspective, there's a bias and there's different assumptions being made. And what we don't want to do is do that. We want to ground everything we're starting from what we're hearing from folks. So that's why we use empathy interviews, to just ask open questions and just literally record back what we're hearing. And so our time today is going to be spent really trying to pinpoint the explicit voice of stakeholders, get in underneath what's behind those needs of stakeholder experiences, and let that then guide where we go in terms of ideas and topics and solutions. So this conversation is really going to tee up what we're going to do in working groups, which are the activities that smaller groups of folks are going to be doing outside of our big meetings. This is really trying to give those working groups the real meat to take and move forward. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish moving forward for today. So really quickly, the root cause analysis is not too complicated, but it does take work. And what we're going to walk you all through and have you do in small groups is first start with framing the problem by articulating what is the experience and the problems being faced by the priority stakeholders that we're talking to that are closest to the problem. Just really trying to put into words, what are they experiencing and why they're experiencing it? And from there, the next step is to just literally keep asking the question, why, to uncover what's underneath that. So if users are experiencing a certain type of issue or problem, ask why. And then when you get a response and thinking about the answer to that why, ask another why, and then ask another why, and then ask another why. Feels tedious, but what it does is really helps as a group us to unlock and dig down deep into the things that are essential and core and systematic to the experiences that we hear folks sharing with us. So there's a 5 whys part of this process. And then that lends itself to then, if you get down to the root why, like the root cause of what's the issue, you then take a stab at brainstorming some how might we statements. So all that is an open brainstorm around what are some of the possible ways to address that root cause that gets you down from those 5 whys. Doesn't have to be the perfect solution, doesn't have to be something that fixes all problems, but it allows you all to have the chance to say, how might we do something about X, Y, Z? Very similar to what I think what Tim and his team did at Georgia State. And then lastly, as we start to kind of see how those how might we statements cluster, we ask the question, are there any topic areas that seem to connect those how might we statements, whatever those may be? We're very open to that. And so this is really a intentional but very basic way of trying to take the data and the insights we're hearing from folks and unpack them in a way that lets us keep things very much stakeholder centered, very much at the root of why they're experiencing what they're experiencing, and then what may be potential ways to address those experiences. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly screen share with you. Susan put in a link to the Google Doc that is what we're going to use for our small group breakouts. And so as she noted earlier, if you still had any other comments or reflections from our data discussion, feel free to put them here in the chart on page 1 of the Google Doc. But as you scroll down below, you're going to see that we're going to break out into 5 small groups again. You're going to have a facilitator, and you're going to have a note taker. And we're going to try to meet for about 35 minutes. And in our small groups, try to walk through what the root causes are for some of our really signature implications that we elevated. So you'll see that as a place to start, we just created like 4 big buckets of some of the, the areas that we were hearing from some of the data and the stakeholder findings. So you have K-12 higher ed alignment, persistence and completion, adult learners, and intersegmental collaboration. So those are things that more or less we definitely have been hearing some big rocks that are emerging from our early findings. But we also have a couple of other buckets in case folks just have other things that they feel like are really relevant. Those are there just to kind of ground us in a place to start, but by all means don't define all that may be discussed and important to address in this work. And then within each small group, you'll see that there are going to be 2 implications listed. And those are pulled from those 6 implications that are listed across those 3 slides from the slides we sent out last night, which is like those big kind of 6 areas that kind of elevated from the conversation. So you have student engagement, digital equity, course delivery, enrollment uncertainty, and online instruction and transfer improvements. So what we'd like the small groups to do is first just pick one of those that are in your group's grid, or if you're really super compelled, you can maybe add your own, but just a way to kind of get us started. We'd love you to try to focus on one of those big first 6. And then literally try to articulate a root cause string that we'll call it, which is, putting things in the voice of the stakeholder, unpacking the 5 whys, trying to come to some how might we's, and seeing then if there are any kind of topic areas that connect those how might we's. So what we provided in each grid is an example. It's a very broad example, but it's a way for you to kind of get an idea of how this may work as you talk it out. I'm going to say this to make sure you all are clear. This is not a wordsmithing exercise. So please do not feel like you have to get every phrase or word right. We can do that on the back end, but we do want you to get the spirit of each one of these steps is really important. And you may not get through them all, but at least these first two of this, the stakeholder needs statement and the 5 whys are really important. So what you'll see in this example is a need of community members. So it just reads, community members, which is really the stakeholder group that an organization needs to serve. Those community members need to inform an organization's strategic planning process because those community members represent valuable, diverse voices. But our executive director in this case insists that we interview traditional leaders instead. So one thing you'll notice in that statement is it's not framed with the community members have the problem. They're not the problem. So this is not a, hey, why is it so hard for Black students or adult students? It's not about that. It's about restating challenges that they're facing and equities they're facing in a way that makes their need really, really clear, but also points to underlying why are they experiencing it. So in this situation, community members need to have a place when it comes to organizations doing their strategic planning, but they are often left out. Why are they left out? It's not their fault. They're left out because sometimes leaders just do not see the value of what they're bringing and don't even think that they represent real expertise. So that's a challenge. So that's why this statement is written that way. And what it does then, it translates that into a 5 why exercise of, remember, it's not the community members' issue, it's the organizational's issue. So we just start to unpack, why is that the case? Why does the executive director feel like they only want to interview traditional leaders? Maybe it's the ED believes that traditional leaders have the most expertise. Why? Well, maybe traditional leaders are who this organization and their peers look to normally for expertise and advice. Why? Well, maybe the ED and their peers have very limited exposure to the expertise that diverse voices bring. Why? The ED and peers are not aware that these voices and expertise are even missing. They don't even get that it's an important part of the process. Why? Well, maybe because the ED doesn't really know the positive outcomes that come from inclusion or diversity, what it creates for a process. So I'm going to pause there because we can run through the string, but really these first 2 steps are what's critical because it's about making sure that we're grounding whatever we're doing moving forward in a true articulation of what our stakeholders are really experiencing and why that challenge exists, and then really peeling underneath what's at the root of why they're experiencing that. There's lots that's here, and there is the feeling that there's so many other root causes that we may want to unpack. Just know that we're going to do that. We have the working groups and we have a ton of information that we're still getting from the other regions that we're going to use behind the scenes to work through those. But for this limited amount of time that we have on this call, we really want you all to collectively tap into your expertise, tap into your good thinking, and try to really do this for 1 or 2, if possible, key issues and implications that have been elevating in our current conversations. As Susan said, probably feels a little bit frustrating, probably feels like, why aren't we just jumping to solutions? But really, this keeps what we're going to generate student-centered. It keeps it at the heart of doing right by what we're hearing from our stakeholder findings. And it allows us to make sure that whatever we are developing as far as potential recommendations are always going to be rooted in the lived experience that does translate into system issues, but also make sure that it does connect to what has to work its way back to the student, has to work its way back to the faculty member, has to work its way back to the institutional leader. This keeps us honest with that, which is what our equity framework is really all about. So I'm going to take us off the screen share really quickly. I know that's a lot, and it's going to feel like, oh, what are we going to do? Don't let perfect be the evil of good. So you're going to have a facilitator, a note taker that's going to work you through it. And a lot of this is just a process that elevates a ton of good information. So we're going to do that in small groups and then come back for roughly about 20 minutes or so and then kind of share out with everyone what we're hearing, how we're feeling, what's kind of elevating. So before we kind of move to the small breakout groups, any clarifying questions that will just make sure the process is effective for you all? Okay. I don't see any hands raised, so I think I love that you're willing to just kind of go with us with this. So appreciate that. Appreciate you all, being brave and just leaning into this. So Colette is going to break us out into breakout groups. We're going to have slightly different groups than last time because we want to, make sure that we're, cross-pollinating all your good thinking. And then we're going to come back with roughly, we're going to take about 25 minutes. So Colette will bring us back just after the hour, about 12:15, Colette. And then we will resume and kind of share back out with the group. So see you all after the top of the hour.
We lost Michelle
All right,
midstream.
folks, I know that might have felt really abrupt. I'm so sorry. I know everyone is probably right in the middle of a really important, thoughtful insight. And with that, that's why we have the share out, so that you can kind of finish your thoughts and kind of, share back with the broader group what I must imagine are some really interesting, rich thoughts and ideas around stakeholder needs and whys. So let's do that. So we have roughly 20 minutes to share out. As we said, wasn't necessary to get through the entire stream, so let's don't feel any pressure for having to kind of got it right. But I'm sure that quite a bit of needs and root causes were elevated. So we'd love to just kind of open it up. We can go group by group. So I know I was with group 1. We didn't designate a spokesperson, but I'm sure one of our colleagues would feel more than happy to kind of share what we discussed. So maybe group 1, do you want to go first and kind of share out? I know we tackled digital equity. Folks in our group want to kind of share what was uncovered in terms of stakeholder needs and underlying root causes.
Go Daisy.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know which one we're in. Was I in one? Jacqueline, is that what you're telling me?
Sorry, group 3. I'm in group 3.
You weren't in, sorry. Sorry. Monica, or go ahead.
Go ahead, Monica.
No.
Go, Daisy.
I wish I had the document in front of us, but we talked about the digital divide, and what we identified was students of color needing equitable access to technology tools and infrastructure. And we defined it pretty broadly. So that included, yes, Wi-Fi, yes, laptops, yes, professional development for everyone included. And then some of our whys really related back to how this is not a public good. And so we unpacked that. And the other piece that we unpacked is, as we went from brick and mortar to online education, the expectation to teach students in a culturally and anti-racist relevant way, and then why those things weren't happening. And so you can see some of our whys, because it's not a statewide requirement, because our faculty and teachers don't know how to do this, which leads back to the professional development side, the lack of accountability, and then just simply because the majority of people in our state are afraid of people of color. And because those in power don't see it as important to teach our students of color in a culturally and anti-racist way. Team, does that cover it?
Great summary.
Thank you, Team 1. Really quick, do folks have any just questions or reflections on what Team 1 discussed? If not, we can move on to Team 2 or Group 2.
I like the fact that you just didn't call out the tools, having Wi-Fi and laptops, but also the professional training. And I think that goes not only for the users, but also for the providers of the education.
Nathan, that's a good point. And we also talked about not just the tools and the professional development, but also access to a safe place and a consistent place to be engaging in, not only to be engaging in distance learning, also for folks trying to engage in distance teaching.
I want to reiterate a point that Daisy and others made, which is this idea that we shouldn't put the burden on students needing to ask for help, that it was the point made by Tim early on, that if this was at scale and made available, it's the point Keith made also, right? How many times do I have to tell you I'm poor? So it should just be, part of our obligation to help students succeed is to give them the tools that they need.
And start that early, right? So that it is equitable, that it starts early in K-12, that those tools are given and they are learning on them as they move through the spectrum.
All right. Group 1, you represent it. Love it. Thank you so much. Group 2, and I'm happy to screen share back your document, but anyone from Group 2 want to kind of share out?
Okay, Group 2. Hey, Michael, can I put you on the spot?
Of course. Okay, so we talked about course delivery, and a lot of our conversation was about trying to form kind of the way that we should think about it, some of the barriers that we're trying to break, informing some of the questions. So I'll just read off some of them. How might we improve and design the instructional experience for students so that's meaningful online? How might we ensure that learning is happening, and how might we measure that and build meaningful connections? We also, talked about the importance of real-time feedback during this, not only from students, but also from faculty who are kind of on the other side having to administer some of this education, leveraging existing best practices that have already been created and have already been found, but maybe haven't been uncovered to the broader higher education community, and trying to create and make students feel like they are part of an overall community of care that has resources available, that they're able to get what they need and still make that feel that they're part of a community instead of just kind of isolated in their own homes and not part of something a little bit bigger like you would feel like on a campus. I tried to go over it briefly, but I think if anyone else from the team wants to add to that.
I mean, I think the only thing I would add, because Michael did a really great job of summarizing that and also sharing in our small group, that it's just this time is awkward and hard for everyone, right? It's awkward for students, it's awkward for faculty, not used to this online mode of instruction. And I think the gist is that, we don't have time 2, 5, 10 years to read about all of the things we could have done, right? So real focus on how do we get real-time data and analysis and best practice and scale that quickly and ensure that we're not leaving students behind. And specifically, knowing that the research demonstrates that students of color don't do well in online learning environments. Judy also pointed out, like, how do we structure interventions to support students and their various, needs.
And then the last thing I'd say, because I think both Michael and Michelle summarized it well, is just, what parts of online learning do we carry forward beyond the pandemic? I mean, what role will it play, as Bridget was saying earlier this morning, what role will it play in a high quality education after we recover from the pandemic and we are returning to campus life?
Any questions or like reflections or feedback to Group 2? All right, Group 3, you've had enough time to make sure one of you are ready to jump up and get us going. So who wants to kind of share out for what Group 3 discussed?
Hi there. We had a great conversation that focused on transfer and online and the connection between the two and the students that we could serve if we really maximize the design for both of those. Some points that came up, and I think just in general, kind of reframing transfer as not just a can do it, but actually a preferred option. And that should be the design aspiration, that it should be so impeccably done that transfer is something we recommend to everyone so that they can take care of their own educational and employment skill training needs for the duration of their life in the state of California, that people are going to move around and they should feel like the system is so seamless and well designed that they can pop in and pop out and meet their own needs. That the current design, there are impediments, there are little booby traps and landmines that we could focus our attention as a group or a small group, part of our group, to actually tackle those. And if you map some of those obstacles, they usually will map perfectly with the incentives that already exist, because the incentives right now have led to the creation of the system and the outcomes that we have. So it's a matter of understanding what we're currently encouraging and then actually figuring out, like, is that what we really want? And then introducing fundamentally different changes in some of those places, different aspirations, different incentives. We talked about digital divide is going to still be a huge part of this, right? Like it's clearly one of the things we need to address quickly, and it's underlying everything in terms of how educational outcomes are being disproportionately achieved in terms of the equity framework. And I'm trying to think of all the other stuff. It was a very, very thoughtful conversation. So any of my other colleagues, please jump in. Keith, I know you got some good stuff. I know it.
No, we talked about oh, sorry, I messed up my screen. We talked about how you utilize program maps and the Georgia State model, and talking about that progression and making intersegmental and really looking at from dual enrollment through the community college to a four-year college university. So a student who are able to see their program map, and we follow that program map. One of the issues that we have, especially when you have a downsize in budgets, you might not offer a science class that student needs as it relates to their program map. By not doing that, the student's not able to complete their degree or certificate. So we think it's very important that we create program maps, and the program maps are intersegmental, and you include the K-12, community college, and the CSU. The other piece that we talked about, which I think was very important, was how can we increase the conversations among the different segments, the UC, the CSU, the community college, and the K-12, where we're actually having ongoing conversations about the student experience, and not just having conversations about our institution, but how do we improve, not improve, I want to stop using improve, because Bridget said it earlier that about the word improve. I want to step away from that word. But how can we support the transfer experience for our students, and really looking at that through some conversation and dialogue, and making time to have those conversations. I know we're all busy, but can we make time to have these conversations? One of these that I will put as example, we have a new agreement with Cal State Dominguez Hills regards to data sharing. We're going to start sharing all of our data with Dominguez Hills. We already have a data sharing agreement with our K-12 districts. Now we're going to have one with Dominguez Hills, so we'll be able to show all the data and the progression of our students. So why can't we do that in every single region where we're sharing data about our students and the student experience? But it goes back to those conversations, and conversations are about relationships. I hope everyone knows that. It's all about relationships.
Anyone else from group 3 or folks from other groups that have like questions or reflections or thoughts from what group 3 discussed? I'll just quickly comment on, Keith, your last thought about, what coherence really looks like. And you articulated it in a way that you kind of can't wait for coherence to exist in the system. Leaders have to make decisions of things they're going to intentionally do differently, and then just take the steps to do it and figure out the partnerships and the mechanisms and the infrastructure that makes it work, and it grows and gets better. But I love the way you described it, because so much of what we want these recommendations to be grounded in is coherence across the segments. And you just described what that looks like. It's really about how well leaders identify an issue and don't wait for someone to give them permission to do something about it, and take that step to say, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? And then build models that others learn from and grow and gets replicated. So I encourage you all, as you think about the way we are identifying opportunities. I love the fact, Keith, what you describe is, and kind of what Tim said, focus on what you can do and what you can control. And I think that's a great description of that, especially because it ties to data, and data has been such a prevalent theme throughout our conversation today. Okay, before we transition, because this is all in service of what's coming next, which is the working groups and our upcoming task force meetings. Any other just general thoughts about this experience? I know that, doing this root cause analysis and user statements isn't fun, but very necessary. So just any reflections or thoughts about like that exercise or other things that kind of came up. Bridget, looks like your hand is up, so you can go ahead and make a comment.
I appreciate the facilitation, and I know that as we're doing this, it's not going to bring every idea forward necessarily. I did want to flag that there's one topic that I see in every state that shows up in this equity space that you might consider in later working group conversations, and that is who ends up being in leadership on college campuses, and who ends up being faculty, who ends up being the chair, the dean, et cetera. There is a backdoor that often is unregulated, and that is interim positions. And I rarely see a state with an intentional strategy around accountability about who gets selected to be an interim. And I just want to flag that I see this across every state, that we are socialized to seek out white males in times of uncertainty. It's how society, like narrative storytelling. And so I see that show up every time, that anytime there's an interim, it's most of the time, that's who's selected. And if you are selected for an interim, you are then more likely to believe that you can do that job. So then we see that in hiring pools. If you look at the presidents who I've worked with across the country, the vast majority have been at some point interim. And so if you want to be intentional about representation on your org charts, this is something that nobody seems to deal with, but I see consistently is actually leading to disproportionate representation throughout the academy. And we know this affects students. If you can't be it if you don't see it. This is something, at least having institutions like be accountable and publicly report for every interim position in their institution, the demographics, that would be powerful. But I see this time, like for instance, I have an institution selected in the midst of COVID, an interim president, and now they're the full president, and the demographics again align exactly as I said. So they're just little things like that you can be hopefully compiling in our conversations, that I actually think there are policy changes that you could make that are small, but actually will make a dramatic change in the future.
Really appreciate that, Bridget. Millie, were you going to say something? Go ahead, Millie.
I've seen that across the country as well. People come in as interim, mostly people who are not of color, and then they get the position with no search. So I've seen that too. Or make-believe search.
So all this feedback is really helpful, because it all, Bridget, to your point, it all has a place somewhere. What's great about this process is we're going to be gathering information along the way, and then really pivoting as we go to then say, if root cause is leading us down this path, then it's not only about, well, we're going to come up with some solution options, but it's about how can we get smart and what else can we learn about certain paths that we may be going down. And so really encourage you all, don't feel like there's any topic that doesn't fit in one of those 4 buckets. It's less about those buckets and much more about what those buckets then and the conversations then stimulate about what's underneath all this equity issue. And we'll figure out within the working groups and on the back end how to make it fit. But those are the right kind of ideas that get at the heart of what's chronic, what's been going on before COVID, and what really does kind of create these systematic barriers that get in the way. So really appreciate that insight. Okay, let's move on as we wrap up. We have about 20 minutes. I'm going to just screen share. Where we're going from here. So, so as we discussed, this conversation really was an important part of just elevating as much as we can in terms of what's really relevant in terms of the root causes from what the findings have been showing us to date. We're going to be coming back in October as well with our full set of findings from all the regionals. But we know that work has to kind of move in parallel as we are gathering information. So with that in mind, we're going to be launching our working groups this month. And the plan was always that we had our standing general task force meetings, but in between meetings, we would be doing working groups where we would go deeper with a smaller group of folks and really start to unpack and try to do some of that nitty gritty kind of solution generation that's all rooted in, you know, user experiences and root causes. So we're at that point now. So, you know, the plan is to have a set of small working groups, maybe 5 to 7 members, comprised of any task force members that want to volunteer, but also if you all have recommended participants, either from your teams or just from colleagues you know, we'd love to consider having them, you know, be a part of these working groups. We'll be meeting probably weekly or bi-weekly, and we have some information that kind of shows you how we kind of see us being able to schedule these out over the next couple of months. And really the goal is to kind of take information that we're gathering from data, information that we're gathering from the task force conversations, and then just trying to really workshop those into some early solution options that can inform the task force's final set of recommendations. We see these working groups really being design teams because we're trying to redesign systems that are not serving important students and communities well. And so we're going to take a design approach with this, and we see them really being grounded around 3 key elements. One is intersegmental coherence. So kind of as Keith was articulating, like equitable ways of thinking and working together with people and components across segments with clear purpose and focus. So, you know, not having one hat, you know, bias another hat. It's really about putting the equitable needs of students at the center and trying to advance that in ways that are connecting across silos, tearing down barriers in ways that really does make the system work for who they're meant to work for. So with that, there'll be these design briefs. So we're thinking about a design approach that just gives this process some structure. There's gonna be a lot of ideas coming to and important things that are gonna be discussed. We're gonna have a very clear, structured way that we're gonna try to pull in all those good ideas and work through them and document them in a way that's organized, in a way that structures the recommendation development process. So there's gonna be some structure around this as well. And then lastly, the scenario planning is the element that really takes into understanding that this is really meant to be recommendations that live midterm and long-term. And there's a lot of uncertainty and things that are still gonna need to be realized across that time horizon. So we have to account for that. So we're gonna make sure that any kind of options that get developed assess and account for impact factors and risk and likelihood and go no-go thresholds to make sure that we're being realistic about the flexibility that some of these recommendations have to inherently embody. And with that as well, because Susan kind of talked about like us workshopping and prototyping, we're gonna share those options as we go with the same stakeholders that we were listening to with our stakeholder conversations. We're gonna come back to them and share with them just the way that things are tracking in terms of solution options and how they really reflect what we think we heard from our regional conversations. So the way you kind of saw things framed on the Google Doc is our starting recommendation is just 4 really broad buckets of way to organize the working group. So we have 4 here: K-12 higher ed alignment, persistence and completion, intersegmental collaboration, and adult learners. By all means, these don't necessarily have to articulate the only things that are important, but we feel like these address some of the really key either stakeholder needs or implications that we saw elevating from what we were seeing so far. They can and should be broad by now, but once we start to get into the working groups will then start to really dig and take some of those root causes that seem most viable, most primed for opportunity, and get more specific and start to go through very clear solution options. We very well may or may not have a set of recommendations that equally touches upon every one of these topics, but we feel like the best place to start to really drill down and have us explore and grow and go deep around what we're learning, what we're trying to develop around solution options. So with that in mind, what we love to come out of this conversation with is a way just to get these groups started. So we'd love to get an idea of task force member volunteers or recommendations that you all have from your teams or others that you know in the field. We definitely do see this as an opportunity to engage outside these meetings. I mean, we'd love to be able to meet more and have more time, but we're on a very clear timeline to get through these recommendations by November. So we can only fit in so many 3-hour meetings in that time, but we can supplement those meetings with these working group conversations. So if by chance a task force member can't attend every general meeting, the working groups could definitely be another place where you all plug in or have someone for your team plug in to make sure that your insights and expertise is represented. So to get your ideas and see who wants to be participating in these groups, we're gonna have a Google Doc, and we're also gonna have, as part of our final feedback survey from this meeting, a chance for you all to raise your hand and say, yes, I want to volunteer, or yes, I have someone from my team that I feel will be great to participate in one of these working groups. So what I'm going to share with you all really quickly is a look at what those working group look like, so you can see an idea of where we're going with this. So this is the Google Doc that's going to be sent around, and it just has, quick place for you to put your name if you want to volunteer or recommend someone that you think will be great for one of the groups. And then we also have the set of dates that are already locked in for each respective group. And you see that we try to balance as many as we can in between our broader task force meetings, and just give folks a chance to get together as often as possible. That allows folks to, thought partner and come up with ideas, but then also at first go back and work through those ideas and come up with some options to move forward. And then we have here at the bottom roughly the time commitment that this takes. So it's a little bit different across the groups, mainly just because of availability and the timing of things. But we wanted you all to know that this will be sent out to you all so you can best assess what group makes the most sense, maybe about availability or just by expertise and area of interest. We're going to launch them all the week of September 21st, and we'll use next week to finalize all the participants and then share out any little bit of pre-work that may get you all primed and ready as we get going and getting those groups underway. So let me, I'll go back to our slides. And then, so this is a slide that kind of shows, roughly kind of what the blocks of time look like, moving forward, and kind of what the time commitments may look like, and the way we're just balancing things across all of the, in between the different task force meetings. And then just would love to, this isn't easy, and this isn't something that we feel, necessarily allows us all of the time we would love to have to do this, but we feel like this right balance between the general task force meetings and then working groups, doing some idea generation, bringing that back to the group, getting feedback from the group, and going back in the working groups is the best way to try to attack this from multiple angles to get us further along and make sure that we come out of this with a set of recommendations that is responsive to what we're discussing in the broader group, but also really does represent some of that more targeted, focused exploration that the working groups will be able to do. So before we move on and finalize with next steps, let's just pause really quickly and make sure we're clear about any follow-up or questions that folks have about this approach, how we're organizing working groups, and kind of what comes next.
How large are the working groups, or how large are you looking for them to be, or do they vary in size?
They'll likely vary in size. Michael, great question. Ideally, we're thinking somewhere around 5 to 7 folks, because that seems like a manageable group that has enough representation but can move work. But we're not going to turn down, eager folks that are looking to move this work forward. We will say this though, to that point, Michael. We know that as working groups discuss things, we may need to get smarter about certain things. So if we need to then, from a conversation of a working group, do an additional interview with a stakeholder, if we need to do a focus group with faculty members to explore a certain topic, we can extend our expertise in the group as we need to. So while those 5 to 7 members may, represent a certain representation of institutions, nothing's holding us back from doing some additional legwork within the working groups to pull in insights as we may need to. Great question. Any other thoughts or questions?
Carl, we had talked last time about possibly if you could get your hands on any landscape or any kind of process maps, or I'm trying to remember journey maps that have already been created across student populations. Were you able to find any of those? I think as we're having conversations in particular about the collaboration between sectors, like seeing a transfer map of what certain demographics of students, what their current experience is like, so that will narrow our focus. Then we can look at what the incentives are, what the actual issues are, but it might inform also with the persistence and completion conversation.
Yeah, great suggestion, Bridget. I remember you mentioning that in our small group last time. We haven't yet, but we can. And we also feel like that's the spirit of our empathy interview approach with all of our stakeholder conversations, are really meant to try to elevate those lived experiences and kind of what that journey represents. So in addition to going out and trying to find some of those maps, we'll also make sure that as we try to relate back to you all what we're hearing, that it can be represented in a way that really does kind of tell that story of what different kind of student experiences and different backgrounds, like what that journey looks like, and like mapping that in a way that makes what solutions could pinpoint in terms of challenges in that experience much more clear and targeted. So we appreciate that feedback. We'll definitely incorporate that moving forward.
Right. It doesn't have to be too complicated. I'm looking for just like the number of forms that we expect an adult learner to fill out if they were to navigate their experience. Like we could, if we just were to minimize that by like cut it in half because we make things a little bit more seamless, that would be a win for equity. I think there are some, we need some quick wins. We need some easy, some clear stuff that will help us kind of narrow our attention. And then from there, I think it will drive. Otherwise, we don't want this to turn into something that we don't actually have tangible recommendations that action can be taken on immediately.
Totally makes sense. Any other quick questions about the working groups before we kind of wrap up and talk about next steps and what's coming next in the task force process? And by the way, here's a copy of that Google Doc that has the working group signups. Okay. So thanks again for a really, really good, rich conversation. As you all know, the great thing about the Google Docs that we have is, in addition to what you all are sharing in the conversation, we're capturing everything that you're sharing in either the comments or on the Google Docs. So we're going to take all that information, and there are likely just other really important root causes that got elevated that on our end, we can do the work of workshopping those and then coming to those working groups ready to kind of start with those root causes identified. So don't feel like, as Susan said, it might feel like we kind of felt kind of, like we didn't finish the job on the breakouts. No worries, like so much was elevated that we're going to take all that good kind of brainstorming and thought partnership, and we're going to put that to good use for the working groups. So next steps, as we did last time, we're going to have a feedback survey to get your all thoughts about how this meeting went. That'll include a prompt if you want to raise your hand for a working group to either volunteer or recommend someone. Go ahead and add that in on the feedback survey, or you can just go directly into the Google Doc and jot down anyone you think will be good to participate. So that'll be coming back to you all shortly. Just also plug that also in the feedback survey, we're going to ask if there are any other team members that you all want to see a task force member spotlight like we did for Tim. You can also go ahead and recommend and ask for folks that you feel like you want to hear more insights from in some of our future meetings. We're going to send out the call notes and next steps from this call like we normally do, and then we're going to get going. We're getting the working groups scheduled and underway. Beyond that, we have work to do in between the next meeting in October. So that includes we're going to be continuing and finalizing all of our regional stakeholder interviews and focus groups. We're also going to be doing any kind of good ideas that elevated around additional data that we feel we can get our hands on. We're going to add that to our growing body of data analysis and have that to share back with you as well in October if we come up with any good things. And then we're going to be launching the task force working groups as we described. And really, our next meeting is going to be on the 13th from 11 to 2. And really, we're going to have a continuation of this conversation in a way because we're going to bring back to you all what our final regional stakeholder conversations elevated and what that looked like, and like really, you know, unpack fully what all of the equity gaps look like and, you know, what that elevates in terms of implications for, you know, equity needs moving forward. If there's any additional root cause analysis discussion that we've either started that we want to get your input on or that we need to start coming out of the additional stakeholder conversations, we're going to have a little bit of time to do that with you all in October. And then really importantly, we're going to start to live out that, that give and take between the working groups and the broader group. So by then, the next meeting, we will have at least a couple or few working group meetings under our belts. We're going to come back to the larger group with just what are some of these early initial solution options looking like? How do they tie back to the root causes that were identified? What do they mean in terms of any additional vetting that needs to happen in terms of scenarios or in terms of you know, more stakeholder feedback in terms of external conditions that may, you know, impede some of those options. We're going to really leverage you all to start to poke holes in a good way in any of those solution options, and then get your feedback to help inform where the working group can then take that information and then go back and go deeper and try to, you know, tighten up those things in a way that makes it kind of clear what some actionable recommendations for the group can really be centered around. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and we are at time. So you all were awesome. Thank you so much for the way you engaged and
thank you, Carl.
Leaned
Thanks
into
for
the
your leadership.
process. Yeah, appreciate you all. Lande, I'll let you wrap. Any final thoughts before we let the group go, Lande?
My only final thought is that, you know, I was looking at the list and about half of the work groups, so it's 5 to 7, have already been filled out. So y'all are on it, which is great. But I think that also means that we should be mindful that everyone may not be able to, I think we want to make sure that we're, you know, including a whole bunch of voices in that. So not everyone may be able to be on every working group. So it may be that Ed First needs to circle back with you about, you know, do you have a priority for this group or that group? We're going to try and accommodate as much as we can, but I just wanted to put that out there. Definitely, if you have interests of your own or someone else, note that now. Don't constrain yourself now, and we'll do the follow-up work. And then just thank you for your participation. Someone sent me a note today while we were talking and said, "Can we do this every day?" And I was like, "I'm in." So you all might not want to do this every day, but I really appreciate hearing from all of you and just your engagement and your commitment to this work. So thank you.
All right, folks, you're awesome. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Jackie and Mario, I'll leave the chat up for a little bit if you need to cut and paste any good comments from the chat, so I can, you know, keep the line open for a couple more minutes if that would be helpful. If not, just let me know and I can end this.
It should be, Colette, it should be saved, right? We should have a text file with all the chat.
Yeah. I think,
Oh, do we? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay.
Part of the
All right,
recording.
team. You're all awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah. All right. Take care, folks. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.